There's a moment, and most ranchers will tell you they've had it at least once, when you're standing in a field at the wrong end of dusk, mud on your boots, the wind cutting sideways off the mesa, and something broken is lying in front of you that you don't have a single good reason to save. Most people walk away. She didn't. I've been keeping this log for 11 years. I've written down thunderstorms, cattle drives, 2 funerals, and 1 wedding I wasn't invited to, but attended anyway from a hill half a mile east. I've recorded the ordinary mechanics of frontier survival with the same clinical detachment my father taught me. Distances, weather patterns, feed costs, water table depths. But I've never written anything like her. Her name was Emmeline Voss. She was 34 years old, recently widowed, operating a quarter-section ranch that everyone in Tucson County agreed was already dead. The land was dry. The herd was thin. The bank had sent its 3rd letter in as many months, and the envelope was still sitting unopened on her kitchen table when I first rode past her property line on a survey job I'd taken for the Territorial Road Commission. What I saw that afternoon stopped me cold. She was lifting a calf, a newborn, pale and limp as a wet rag, its legs folded wrong, its breathing so shallow I couldn't see it from 20 yards out into the bed of her truck. Alone, no ranch hand, no neighbor leaning over the fence with advice. Just her and the animal and the fading light, and whatever private arithmetic she was running in her head that made keep the answer instead of let go. I should have ridden on. The road commission paid by the mile, and the survey didn't care about a woman and a dying calf in a failing field. I pulled my horse up and wrote the first sentence of this entry instead. I didn't know then that I'd be filling 70 pages more. Her name was already legend. By the time I understood, I was watching one. That's the thing about legends. They don't announce themselves. They happen in mud, in poor light, with hands that shake and backs that ache, and no one watching but a stranger on a borrowed horse with a surveyor's notebook and a habit of writing things down he has no business recording. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't even particularly graceful about it. The calf slipped twice before she got a solid grip. She said something under her breath the second time it slipped, something sharp, possibly profane, and I liked her immediately for it. The animal weighed maybe 40 pounds, but 40 pounds of sick weight, dead limb weight, the particular uncooperative heaviness of a body that doesn't know yet whether it wants to fight for itself. She had the calf's front legs braced across her left forearm and its hindquarters cradled in the crook of her right elbow, and she was walking across uneven ground in boots that had seen better years, toward a truck that was older than its boots, and she didn't slow down once. I was taking notes before I realized I was doing it. Emmeline Voss, approx. 56. Brown hair braided, loose end tucked into collar, single deliberate stride, no hesitation at the truck bed despite difficulty of lift. Calf Holstein cross, 2 days at most, possibly less. Animal non-responsive, woman not. That last line felt important enough that I underlined it. She got the calf into the truck bed with one final heave that she didn't make look easy, because it wasn't easy, and then she leaned against the side panel for exactly 3 seconds, catching her breath. And then she was moving again, tailgate, driver's door, engine, and the truck was pulling away down a dirt road that technically belonged to the Road Commission's survey grid and practically belonged to no one. I followed at a distance. Professionally, I told myself. The road ended at her property line, and I needed to log its condition anyway. My property log entry for that stretch of road was the shortest I ever wrote. Her ranch was called the Voss Quarter. It had been the Voss Quarter since her husband's grandfather staked the claim, and it had been declining since her husband, Thomas Voss, died of a fever 18 months prior, leaving Emmeline with 42 head of cattle, a broken-down irrigation pump, 2 horses, and a boy of 11 named Caleb who was old enough to be worried but too young to be useful and smart enough to know the difference. I knew this because the Territorial Road Commission kept records of landowners, and I kept records of everything. I did not know, riding up to her fence line that first evening, that the calf she just loaded into her truck would become the axis around which the next 3 years of her life would turn. I did not know she'd name it after the creek that cut through the north pasture, or that it would grow into something the county fair judges wouldn't have a proper category for, or that its existence would eventually force 3 different conversations with 3 different men who each believed they had a claim on what she'd built. I only knew she'd carried something broken home when she could have left it, and that felt, at the time, like the most important piece of data I'd collected in 11 years of surveying. Her boy Caleb was on the porch when she pulled up. I had stopped my horse at a respectful distance, the kind of distance that says I'm not a threat without quite saying I'm also not leaving, and I watched him come down the steps to help his mother without being asked. That detail went in the log too. An 11-year-old who reads the situation and acts on it without prompting is either very well raised or very accustomed to necessity, and with a boy in that circumstance, it was usually both. "What is it?" he asked, peering into the truck bed. "Holstein Cross, born too early or abandoned, both maybe." She was already pulling on the rear gate. "Get the barn lamp, the good one, not the one with the cracked chimney." He went. She didn't watch him go. She was already back to the calf, talking to it in a low voice that I couldn't hear from where I sat but could recognize by its rhythm, the particular cadence of someone negotiating with a body that has not yet decided to live. I have a habit of noting things I shouldn't. My father called it a weakness. My surveying supervisor called it an asset. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the truth in this instance was that watching Emmeline Voss work was like watching someone who had decided, firmly and without drama, that giving up was structurally incompatible with who she was, and that this decision had been made so long ago she no longer experienced it as a decision at all. She had the calf half lifted again when she noticed me. She didn't startle. That was the first surprise. Most people catching a stranger on horseback, watching them in fading daylight on a property with a history of dispute with the road commission, would have reached for something, a word, a rifle, a defensive posture of some kind. Emmeline Voss looked at me the way you look at whether you've already assessed and found manageable. "You with the survey?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're on my fence line." "Road Commission survey line runs right up to it. I haven't crossed." She considered this. The calf hung in her arms, doing its best impression of dead. "You going to sit there, or you going to come help me get this animal into the barn?" I tied my horse to her fence post, which was not a road commission-sanctioned activity, and climbed over her fence line, which was even less so. I wrote a note in the margin of my log, crossed property boundary. Reason, requested assistance. Time, 6:43 p.m. The calf smelled of blood and amniotic fluid, and the particular mineral smell of the mesa clay. It was lighter than it looked, which was its own kind of bad sign. We carried it between us into the barn, and Caleb had the lamp burning already, set on a flat-topped feed barrel, throwing a warm circle of orange light that made the whole space feel like something out of a painting that would have been too sentimental to hang anywhere respectable. "Thank you," she said, not looking at me, already kneeling in the straw beside the animal. I stood in the doorway and wrote, "Animal breathing. Irregular, woman focused, boy watching." Her name was Emmeline, M to the county records, Mrs. Voss to the bank letters, Emmeline to no one but herself, and possibly her dead husband, and now, apparently, me. Because I had written it in full the first time and felt the name was the kind that didn't abbreviate well. I learned her story in pieces over the following days, because the survey stretched along the full eastern edge of her property, and because I am, professionally, a man who works slowly when a job interests him. Thomas Voss had been a good rancher and a better husband, which is the particular combination that makes a loss like his one of the clean-cut, uncomplicated kinds. The kind where the grief is pure because the marriage was, and where rebuilding is hardest because there's nothing bitter to stand on. He died in March. By the following November, she'd sold 14 head to cover the note due to the bank, reducing the herd to 28, which was the lowest the property had run since his grandfather's first winter. The remaining cattle were decent stock. Emmeline knew her animals, but 28 head on a quarter section with one broken pump and 2 horses and a boy doing half days of school and half days of labor was a mathematics that kept arriving at the same wrong answer. The calf was not part of any plan. She found it in the north pasture, in the dry creek bed below the cut bank, in the 30-minute window between when she'd checked the pasture at 4:30 and when she'd gone back at 5. The mother was gone, had cleared the fence somehow, or more likely had been gone already, and the calf had wandered and dropped from exhaustion. There were tracks going south, toward the Henderson Properties open section, but she hadn't followed them. What was in the truck was what mattered. She told me this on my 3rd visit, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, Caleb having gone to the feed store in the wagon for grain she'd ordered the week before. "You could have left it," I said. This was a professional observation, and also a genuine inquiry, because I had been trying to understand the decision and hadn't managed it yet. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. Her eyes were the particular dark brown of wet creek clay, not beautiful in any conventional sense, but the kind of eyes that made you feel observed rather than looked at. Could have, she said. Most people would have. Most people leave a lot of things. She didn't say it as judgment. She said it the way you'd say it rains more in spring, as a fact about the landscape of human behavior, recorded and filed and not particularly interesting to discuss. Is it going to make it? I asked. She looked out at the north pasture, where the calf was in the barn and the mesa was going red and gold in the afternoon light. I don't know, she said, but it's going to try. What I know about calves that survive their first 72 hours is this. They are often the wrong ones. The ones that look most likely to make it sometimes don't, and the ones who look wrong from the start, legs folded crooked, breathing shallow, arrived too early or abandoned too soon, sometimes develop a stubbornness that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with whatever it is that decides, at the cellular level, to keep. This calf was the wrong kind. She'd gotten colostrum into it with a bottle the first night, working by lamplight while Caleb slept, and by the next morning it had lifted its head. By the evening after that, it was attempting to stand, failing, attempting again. By the fourth day, it was standing long enough to drink on its own, though its legs still moved with the careful uncertainty of something that hadn't fully committed to the mechanical logic of walking. She named it Arroyo, after the creek bed where she'd found it. The name seemed too large for what it was. A pale, thin, knock-kneed thing with an absurdly long face, and eyes that tracked her with the particular intensity of an animal that has imprinted on the wrong species. But she said it without self-consciousness, and Caleb started using it immediately, and so Arroyo it was, and somehow by the end of the first week the name had settled into rightness the way names sometimes do. He follows her, Caleb told me on my fifth visit, with the specificity of an 11-year-old reporting a discovery of geological importance. Like a dog, everywhere she goes in the barn, he goes. Calves do that sometimes, I said, when they imprint. I know, he said, in a tone that gently indicated he had already looked this up and didn't need the explanation. I mean, he's different, though. He's not just following, he's watching her, like he's trying to figure something out. I wrote that down, too. Calf, observational, following pattern atypical per boy's assessment. Boy, accurate observer. That was not a professional log entry. I'd stopped pretending by that point that the log entries about the Voss quarter were professional. My surveying work on that stretch of road took 9 days. The commission expected it in 5. I filed the report with a note about difficult terrain conditions, which was not entirely false. The eastern mesa edge had one particularly uncooperative section near a dry wash, and I took my time about it, and the commission accepted the explanation because road commissions, by nature, are not suspicious of surveyors who work slowly. They are suspicious of surveyors who work fast, because speed usually means corners cut, and cut corners in road survey mean trouble later. On my last official day, I told Emmeline the survey was complete. She nodded. We were standing at the fence line, Arroyo visible through the barn slats, the late morning sun making everything look easier than it was. You'll come back, she said, not a question, not quite an invitation, somewhere in between the way some sentences are. Probably will, I said. Road Commission resurveys every other year. That's not what I meant. She was already walking back toward the barn before I had to figure out how to respond to that. I sat on my horse for a long moment. The wind was coming off the mesa, carrying the smell of dry grass and the distant hint of rain that wasn't going to arrive. Arroyo made a sound from the barn, a thin, reedy call that didn't sound like any calf I'd heard before, almost questioning, like it knew something had just been decided and was waiting to hear what. I opened my log. Day 9, survey complete. Departing Voss Quarter, 10:47 a.m. Note, recommend resurvey of eastern section within 1 year rather than 2. Terrain unstable near dry wash. Will need revisiting. The terrain near the dry wash was fine. I'd noted it as such in the official report. I closed the log. I came back the following Thursday. The first sign that something unusual was happening came at 6 weeks. Arroyo was gaining weight, which was expected once survival was established. but he was gaining it at a rate that made Emmeline's neighbor, a stocky German-born rancher named Pieter Moss, who ran a proper operation 3 miles north, stop at her fence and look for a long time without saying anything. Moss was the kind of man who communicated in silences. He had 4 different silences that I'd cataloged by then: the silence that meant disapproval, the silence that meant calculation, the silence that meant grudging respect, and the silence that meant he was about to offer to buy something. This was the 4th silence. "What are you feeding it?" he said finally. "Same as the others." She was leaning on the fence next to him, watching Arroyo move across the pasture. He was still knock-kneed, still slightly too long in the leg, but the movement had taken on a quality of, I didn't have the right word then. I wrote deliberate in the log and underlined it twice. "It's going to be large," Ma said. "Yes," she said. "How large?" "I don't know yet." Another silence, this one I hadn't cataloged before. "You should enter him at the county show," he said, "when the time comes." Emmeline looked at him with an expression I'd only seen her use twice, once when the bank letter arrived, and once when the pump failed in the first hard frost. The expression of someone who has just been handed an idea that is simultaneously too large and exactly the right size. "I'll think about it," she said. Moss nodded, got back in his wagon, and left. I wrote Moss noticed. Emmeline considering, Arroyo still growing. Whatever comes next, it will be significant. I wasn't wrong about much in those years of logging, but that last entry was the most right I ever was. The thing about that first part of the story, the calf, the truck, the barn, the naming, is that it looks, in retrospect, like a simple rescue narrative. A woman saves an animal. The animal thrives. The beginning of a feel-good account. But I was there, and I kept the log, and what I know is this. It wasn't simple, and Emmeline wasn't simple, and the animal she'd lifted into that truck was already, in some way none of us had the vocabulary for yet, becoming something the county didn't have a box for. There was one moment, near the end of that first month, that I didn't write down initially. I went back and added it later, in smaller handwriting in the margin with an asterisk. I had arrived at her place on a Wednesday morning to find her standing in the pasture, completely still, while Arroyo stood beside her, also completely still. Not the stillness of animals resting. The stillness of 2 things communicating in a frequency that didn't require sound. Caleb was on the porch watching. I stopped my horse at the gate and watched too. It lasted maybe 4 minutes. Then she put her hand on the calf's neck, not patting, just resting, the way you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you trust. And she said something I couldn't hear, and he made his reedy sound, and they both moved at the same time, back toward the barn. I wrote, something is happening between this woman and this animal that is not about rescue anymore. That part is over. Whatever comes next has a different name. I didn't know the name yet. By the time I did, the whole county would know it too. There is a particular quality of light on the Arizona mesa in late October that I have tried to describe in this log 3 separate times, and given up on each time. It is the light of a season that has decided to be honest about endings, and it falls without mercy on everything. The dry grass, the red rock, the cattle in the pasture, the woman moving through her morning rounds with a bucket and a purpose that has started to look, from the outside, almost like momentum. Almost. The bank sent its 4th letter in October. This one was different. I could tell by the way Emmeline held the envelope when she collected the mail, by the slight change in the angle of her shoulders, by the 3 full seconds she stood at the mailbox before putting it in her coat pocket unopened. Caleb saw it too. His expression was the particular controlled nothing of a child who has learned that visible worry makes things worse for his mother, which is one of the harder lessons any child learns, and most learn it later than he had. I was at the fence line that morning. I had no official reason to be there. The Territorial Road Commission's resurvey wasn't due for another 8 months. But I had developed a habit of writing that stretch on the days I didn't have active contracts, which the commission permitted because I was their most reliable surveyor in the region, and because they knew better than to make inconvenient inquiries about a reliable man's habits. "Morning," I said. "Morning," she walked past me toward the barn. "Coffee's on if you want it." I tied my horse and went in. Arroyo was 4 months old by October, and the word large that Pieter Moss had used in August had already become insufficient. He was still growing at a rate that had stopped being explicable in terms of good feed and early care, and had started being explicable only in terms of the specific animal he was, the particular combination of breed lines and initial adversity and something else. Something I kept writing in the log as will because I didn't have a better word, that had produced in him a physical presence that made strangers stop at the fence the way Moss had, and look, and not say anything for a while. He was not beautiful exactly. His conformation was unusual. The long legs had grown into something more powerful than graceful, and his head was still slightly too large for proportionality, and the pale color of his coat had developed into an off-white with faint gray undertones that didn't match any standard classification I knew. But there was a quality about him that I could only describe as authority. He moved through the pasture like he had decided the pasture was his, not in aggression, but in the calm certainty of something that has assessed its world and found it adequate. He still followed Emmeline. This had not diminished with age, as it does with most imprinted cattle. If anything, it had grown into something more layered. He didn't shadow her the way young calves shadow their surrogates, frantically, urgently, from inches behind. He followed her the way you'd say someone keeps their eye on something, steadily, from a considered distance with full attention. Caleb had started calling it checking in. He'd say, "Arroyo's checking in," and there the animal would be at the fence line when Emmeline came out of the house, or at the barn door when she crossed the yard, watching her with those tracking eyes until she acknowledged him, a word, a touch on the nose, a look, and then relaxing into his usual composed movement. "It's a little unsettling," I said to Caleb one afternoon, meaning it as a gentle observation. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "I think he's keeping track," he said, "of whether she's okay." I wrote that down, then I underlined it, then I left it alone because some things don't benefit from analysis. The decision about the county show came in a form that was less a decision than an arrival, the kind where you realize afterward that you'd been moving toward it for weeks without naming the direction. Emmeline brought it up herself, on a Thursday morning in early November, with the practical tone she used for practical things. She said the Pinal County Livestock Show was 12 weeks out. She said Arroyo's current growth rate and weight suggested he would hit a category they hadn't been entered in before. She said the prize for the top weight class in the open bovine division was $250, with a trophy that had been won by the same family in Coolidge for 4 consecutive years. "You think he can take it?" I asked. She poured her coffee, set the pot down. "Yes," she said. Not with bravado, not with the hedging qualifications of someone hoping, with the flat, informational confidence of someone who has assessed a situation and arrived at a correct answer. "The Henderson boy entered a Hereford last year," she said. "Pieter Moss has a shorthorn he's been preparing since spring. There are 6 other registered entrants in the weight class from what I've heard." That doesn't sound like a simple win. "No," she agreed, "it's not simple." She drank her coffee. Outside, through the kitchen window, Arroyo was visible in the south pasture, moving with his particular deliberate stride. "But I know what he is," she said, "and the judges will know it when they see him." This was, I would later understand, the sentence where she crossed the line between surviving and competing. It was a small crossing. The wording was ordinary, but I wrote it in the log with a box drawn around it, the way I'd learned to mark things that seemed at the time like turning points. There were 3 problems that Emmeline did not mention in that kitchen conversation. I knew about them because I had been paying attention, which is what surveyors do, and because I had been spending enough time at the Voss quarter that her boy had started greeting me by name, and her horses had stopped reacting to my arrival. The first problem was Arroyo's feed costs. Keeping an animal of his size and growth rate through winter required grain, she was buying at a rate that was nudging the already insufficient operation further into the red. She had sold 2 more head in September to cover it, which left her at 26, which was the number she'd told herself was the floor she wouldn't go below. The second problem was Pieter Moss's shorthorn. I'd seen the animal at Moss's place when I rode that stretch of road the prior month. Moss had been preparing it since spring, as Emmeline said, and it was a magnificent animal, properly conformed, correctly muscled, the product of careful selection and professional management. The kind of animal that won county shows because it was supposed to win county shows. The third problem was a man named Garrett Crow. Crow was the Henderson family's foreman, or had been, until the Hendersons sold the South section, and Crow found himself without formal employment, but with an opinion about every ranch in the county and a willingness to share it. He was not a bad man in any clean sense. He was the kind of man who existed at the intersection of capability and resentment, and had been there long enough that the two had become difficult to separate. He'd come by the Voss quarter in September, ostensibly to ask about a strayed heifer he'd heard might have come through the north pasture. The heifer had not been through the north pasture. What had actually occurred was that Garrett Crow had heard about Arroyo from Pieter Moss's hand, and had come to look. He'd looked, he'd not said much, he'd left. What he'd said later, around town, was that Emmeline Voss was entering a freak animal in a legitimate livestock competition, and that it was an embarrassment to the county's ranching tradition, and that the judges ought to know what kind of operation was behind the entry. I heard this at the feed store, from a man who told me in the tone of someone who disagreed, but wasn't sure it was his fight. I didn't tell Emmeline. I told myself it was because I didn't want to add weight to what she was already carrying. The truer reason, which I wrote down and then crossed out and then wrote again, was that I thought she already knew, and that she had decided it wasn't relevant, and that she was right. The 12 weeks between that November morning and the county show were the kind of weeks that seem, while you're inside them, like they're moving too slowly, and seem, once you're past them, like they moved in a blur. Emmeline worked Arroyo through a conditioning program she had developed herself, based on what she'd read in 3 different agricultural manuals she'd ordered from the territorial library, and what she'd observed about his particular movement and musculature. She was not a woman who operated on intuition alone. She was a woman who gathered information until the intuition had something solid to work with. Caleb helped. He was 12 by then, had added 2 inches of height and 1 visible year of competence to himself since the prior spring, and had developed a specific relationship with Arroyo that was different from his mother's and different from mine. Where Emmeline's relationship with the animal was one of mutual recognition between 2 things that had decided to survive together, Caleb's was simpler and bigger. It was the relationship of a boy and the first magnificent thing he'd ever been allowed to be responsible for. He talked to Arroyo constantly, not the low negotiating talk his mother used. Actual conversation, about school, about weather, about the strayed heifer and Garrett Crow and the county show, and what the prize money might mean. He understands some of it, Caleb told me once matter-of-factly. Cattle don't understand language, I said, a professional observation. He understands tone, Caleb said, with the patient precision of someone correcting a common misconception. And he understands the word show. I've tested it. When I say it, he stands up straighter. I did not write this in the log, because it was the kind of detail that looked, on paper, like sentiment, and I had been trying to maintain some proportion of professional distance in my record-keeping. I thought about it for the rest of that week, though. In January, 3 weeks before the show, the pump broke again. This was the irrigation pump, the same one that had failed in the first frost after Thomas died, and that Emmeline had repaired twice at costs that were not small. It failed at 4 in the morning, in the deepest cold of that winter, and by the time she discovered it at dawn, the south trough had frozen solid, and 6 of her cattle had not had water since the previous afternoon. I found out about it when I arrived that morning, and found her in the south pasture with a hand axe, breaking ice, her breath coming in visible clouds, her face the particular set of a person operating on the side of the line that hasn't decided yet to break. She had been at it for 2 hours. I tied my horse and picked up the spare axe from the tool post without asking. We worked side by side for another 40 minutes, and she didn't say anything unnecessary, and neither did I, and eventually the trough was clear enough for the cattle to drink. We stood there while they drank. "The pump," she said. "I know. It needs parts from Tucson, a week at least, maybe more. Can you manage in the meantime?" She looked at the trough, at the cattle, at the north pasture, where Arroyo was visible moving toward the fence in his checking-in way. "I'll haul water from the creek," she said. "It'll run the wagon 3 times a day." 3 times a day was not manageable, not alone, not with Caleb at school and no hired hand and a broken pump and a county show in 3 weeks. "I'll help," I said, "mornings." She looked at me with the creek clay eyes. "This isn't your ranch," she said, not ungratefully, factually. "No," I said, "it's not." A silence that didn't need filling. The cattle finished at the trough. Arroyo was at the fence now, watching his person. "Thank you," she said. So I hauled water in the mornings for 8 days, until the pump parts arrived from Tucson, and she installed them herself with a manual that took her a full reading and a half to translate into working knowledge. And she did it without complaint and without asking for help. And I was there when she turned the pump on and it ran correctly. And her exhale in that moment was the quietest, most complete thing I've ever heard a human being express. The night before the county show, I found her in the barn. This was not unusual. She was often in the barn at odd hours, and I had developed over the months the habit of checking before I left the property for the evening. What was unusual was that she was sitting in the straw next to Arroyo, her back against the barn wall, her knees pulled up, not doing anything purposeful. Just sitting. He was lying down beside her, which cattle of his size don't typically do in proximity to humans, but which Arroyo did around Emmeline with a regularity that had stopped surprising Caleb or me months ago. I leaned in the doorway. She didn't look up. "I keep thinking about the letter," she said. I knew which letter, the fourth one. The one she hadn't opened until a week after it arrived, and which had contained a timeline rather than a payment demand. A timeline for resolution of the outstanding balance, which was the bank's polite way of saying we are beginning the formal process. "What does thinking about it tell you?" I asked. "That I need this to go right tomorrow." "And if it doesn't?" She rested her head back against the barn wall. Arroyo's breathing was slow and steady beside her, the long, regular breathing of a large, healthy animal at rest, which is one of the quieter sounds in the world and also one of the most complete. "Then I'll figure out the next thing," she said, "but I want this to go right." I sat down in the doorway. We stayed like that for a while. The lamp threw the same orange circle it had thrown on the night she'd carried him in. The barn smelled of straw and clean animal, and the particular cold of a winter night in the Arizona uplands. Arroyo made his sound, the thin, questioning one. Even now, at 4 months and some days, at a size that made the sound slightly absurd, it was still recognizably the sound of the creature she'd carried home in her truck. She put her hand on his neck, just resting, the same gesture as the first time. "He's going to be fine," she said. I wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. I didn't ask. The morning of the Pinal County Livestock Show arrived the way important mornings always do, ordinarily. 6:15 light, frost on the grass. A sky so clear it was almost colorless, the kind that comes after a cold night has done its work and stepped back. Emmeline was up before the frost had lifted, which meant she was up before I arrived at 6:30, which meant Arroyo was already groomed, haltered, and standing in the barn aisle with the calm alertness of an animal that has understood, through whatever mechanism it uses for such things, that today is different. Caleb had been up since 5. I knew this because the kitchen lamp was already out when I arrived, which meant he'd been up so early the lamp had run its useful hours before dawn. He was sitting on the tailgate of the truck when I came around the barn, eating a biscuit, watching Arroyo. He looked simultaneously young and old in the way 12-year-olds do when something large is about to happen. Like the child and the adult, they'll eventually be taking turns in the same body, each borrowing it for the duration of one expression. "You sleep?" I asked. "Some," he said. "Your mother's?" He looked toward the barn. "She's been talking to him since 5:30. I went into the barn. She was at Arroyo's head, hands on either side of his face, talking low. I couldn't make out the words. Didn't try. I stood at the far end of the barn aisle and took my notebook out, not because I intended to write anything, but because holding it had become a kind of nervous habit, and something about the morning was making my hands want something to do. She finished what she was saying. Arroyo pressed his nose briefly into her shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic of bovine behavior that I had stopped cataloging his exceptions, because the list had grown too long to be useful. "He's ready," she said, not to me, to herself, maybe to the barn. Then she straightened, and Emmeline Voss was back in the form I recognized, direct posture, quick stride, the particular energy of someone who has made up her mind and is not interested in revisiting the process. "Let's go," she said. The fairgrounds at the Pinal County Livestock Show. were the kind of place that expands in your memory beyond its actual dimensions. In reality, it was a collection of temporary fencing panels, 3 permanent judging rings, 2 covered pavilions, a row of vendor stalls selling food I couldn't identify and equipment I could, and approximately 400 people moving through all of it with the particular noise and energy of a community event that is, for the people who depend on it, not entertainment but commerce. We arrived mid-morning. The open bovine weight class was slotted for 2 o'clock. I saw Pieter Moss's rig parked on the north side of the grounds. His shorthorn was visible in the holding pens, correctly proportioned, beautifully prepared, the result of a spring's worth of professional conditioning. Several people had already stopped to look at it and nod in the way that means likely winner. I saw Garrett Crow near the judge's registration table. He was talking to a man I didn't recognize but who had the bearing of someone with an official function. I wrote his position in my notebook with one word: note. Emmeline saw Crow too. She didn't stop walking. "He's talking to the judges," I said. "He's talking to someone near the judges," she said. "There's a difference." Emmeline, "I know what he's doing," she said. "And I know what we're doing. Let's stay focused on the second thing." We got Arroyo settled in the holding pen. The other entrance animals were visible in adjacent pens, 6 entries total in the open weight class, as she'd said. They were all solid animals, the kind that belong at a county show. Then the people near the other pens started noticing Arroyo. It happened in stages. First, a couple of neighboring ranchers who stopped their conversation and looked. Then a woman from the registration table who walked over on what looked like a pretextual errand and ended up standing at the fence for 2 full minutes. Then a cluster of 3 men I didn't know who came around the corner of the holding area, saw him, and stopped. Arroyo stood with the composure he always had. He did not perform. He did not display. He simply was what he was: the long legs, the unusual coloring, the too large head, the authority of something that had decided to occupy its space completely. He looked at the people who looked at him with the tracking intelligence that had never diminished, and then he found Emmeline, and his attention settled on her the way it always did, and you could see, if you were paying attention, the specific quality of recognition pass across his face. Caleb was at the fence. He had his hands in his pockets and his chin up, and the carefully neutral expression of someone who is very much aware that people are looking. "They're looking," he said quietly to no one. "Yes," I said. "Is that good?" "I think so." She said not to get too excited until after the judges. "She's right." He nodded seriously, went back to watching. I have kept detailed logs of many events in my 11 years of surveying. I have recorded distances and elevations and soil compositions and property boundary disputes and the progress of road conditions through varying seasons. I have developed, in that time, a belief that the most accurate record of an event is the least emotional one, that removing feeling from observation produces the clearest picture. I believe this less firmly than I used to, because what I wrote during the 2 o'clock judging of the open bovine weight class at the Pinal County Livestock Show was not, in any meaningful sense, detached. What I wrote was: Pieter Moss came to find her after the results. He was a man of silences, as I've said, and the silence he arrived with this time was the one I hadn't catalogued before. The new one that I was only now understanding was the silence of a man revising a belief he'd held for a long time. He shook her hand. He did not say congratulations, which would have been the conventional thing. He said, "He is what I thought he was." She nodded yes. "You've done something significant here," he said, with the flat sincerity of a man who doesn't give compliments often enough to have any practice making them sound natural. "He did most of it," she said. "Don't be modest," Moss said. "Not today." She met his eyes. Something passed between 2 ranchers who respected each other's work, and had never quite said so, and were saying so now, through the medium of a conversation about an animal. "I won't," she said. "Not today." Garrett Crow did not approach her at the fairgrounds. He approached me later at the water station, while Emmeline was completing the registration paperwork for the prize money. He said, "I want you to know I didn't say anything to the judges." I looked at him. "I know people thought I might," he said. "I thought about it. I want you to know I didn't." "Why not?" I asked. He looked across the grounds to where Arroyo was visible in his pen, Caleb beside him. A small crowd of people gathered at the fence with the quality of an audience that doesn't know it's been assembled. "Because I would have been wrong," Crow said, "and I knew it when I saw him in the ring." He left before I could decide what to do with that. I wrote it down verbatim and put a box around it, the way I did with things that changed what I thought I understood. The drive home that evening was quiet in the way of people who have used up all their necessary words and are now moving through the ones that don't need to be spoken. $250. The trophy, which was larger than it had any right to be, riding in the truck bed next to Arroyo, who regarded it with the disinterest of an animal that has larger concerns. Caleb asleep against the passenger window, his face finally relaxed out of the controlled nothing he'd been maintaining all day. I was driving. She'd asked me to because she was tired, and she was not often willing to say so. She was looking out the window at the dark mesa, the road and the headlights, the stars that were becoming visible now that we'd left the fairground lights behind. "That's the bank note," she said, not to me exactly, just putting it into the air between us. "Most of it," I said. "Most of it," she agreed, "enough to get to Spring without selling more head." Arroyo made his sound from the truck bed, the thin, questioning note slightly muffled by the tailgate. She turned slightly, not enough to see him, but enough to acknowledge the sound. "He'll sleep when we get home," she said. "He never sleeps on trips." "He will tonight." She said it with the certainty she reserved for the things she knew. She was right, as she most often was. It was 2 weeks after the county show, when I understood the shape of what I'd been witnessing. I had come back to the Voss Quarter, not for any practical reason, not any longer with the pretext of road commission work, just because it was where I went on the mornings when I didn't have somewhere else to be, and I'd stopped being embarrassed about that. I was at the fence with my notebook. Arroyo was in the north pasture. Emmeline was crossing the yard from the barn toward the house. She stopped in the middle of the yard. He was at the north fence, which was the far end of his pasture from where she stood. She hadn't called him. She hadn't made any sound. She'd simply stopped. He turned. Found her. She stood still. He stood still. 40 yards between them. A clear morning. Wind coming off the mesa, cold and clean. Then she resumed walking toward the house. He resumed moving through the pasture. I stood at the fence with my notebook open, and I thought about what to write, and I wrote nothing for a long time. Here is what I eventually wrote. She carried a weak calf home in her truck in October of last year, because she is the kind of person who doesn't leave something broken in a field if she can help it, and because the mathematics of survival, the particular arithmetic of what is worth saving, and what isn't looks different from the inside of a half-failed ranch than it does from the outside of one. He became what he became because she gave him the conditions, too. Food, warmth, recognition, the daily evidence that he was worth the effort of being kept. This is not magic, and it is not sentiment. It is the oldest animal logic there is. Things grow toward what they're given. What I did not anticipate, and what I have been trying to find accurate language for since October, is what she became in the same period. Because the rescue went both ways, as rescues so often do. She kept him through the worst of the winter, through the fourth bank letter, through the broken pump and the hauled water and the county fair, and the 2 weeks of holding her breath before the judges called it. And in keeping him, she kept something in herself that the prior 18 months had been eroding, the part that knows you're capable of what you're attempting, the part that holds on not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because letting go is not who you are. There will be more bank letters. The pump will fail again. The county show was one season. There are more seasons. But Arroyo is in the north pasture, and Emmeline Voss is in her kitchen, and Caleb is at school for a full day now, not a half day, because there's enough stability to let him be 12 again instead of 12 and necessary. And every morning, for whatever it means, the animal turns when she stops, from 40 yards, from 100 from the far edge of the pasture. She stops and he turns, and they look at each other across whatever distance the day has put between them, and then they both go on. I did not write what happened on the morning. I finally told her about this log. I'll write it now. She read 3 pages, set it down on the kitchen table, did not say anything for a moment. Then, you've been keeping this since October. Yes. About me. About this place, mostly you. She was quiet for a little longer. Why? It was a fair question. I had 11 years of professional answer-giving behind me, and none of them fit. Because I thought something was happening here that someone should write down, I said, before it was over. She looked at me, the creek clay eyes. What made you think it would be over? I opened my mouth to give an answer that turned out to be unnecessary. Because she was already standing up, already moving toward the door, already calling out into the yard for Caleb, already going on to the next part of the morning. The door closed behind her. Through the kitchen window, I could see the north pasture, Arroyo at the fence watching the door.